Just so you know, if an artist ever posts online that using reference is bad, they've just publicly admitted that they've never worked on art in a professional capacity. Let's discuss. I'm Scott Coffin. Welcome back to my digital art channel. And if this is your first time here, well, hi there, hey there, ho there, neighbor. Sit down, click the subscribe button, and stick around for a while. If my spicy take at the beginning of the video didn't give it away, today we're going to be talking about the rights and wrongs and ups and downs of using reference in creating digital art. But before we really dig in, let's talk about the art that you'll be watching me draw in the background today. I let my Twitter and Facebook followers choose a popular character for me to do a redesign of, and the character that they landed on was Froppy from My Hero Academia. I didn't go too crazy with this redesign because of course I wanted the character to remain recognizable, so I kept her hairstyle and her general color scheme because those are both iconic to the character, but I took her costume and leaned a little bit more into the aquatic nature of the character, redesigning her outfit based on the designs of wetsuits generally worn by deep-sea divers and surfers. I apologize in advance if the video isn't quite as high quality as what I normally use, but the settings on my screen capture were a little bit off and I didn't realize it until after I'd recorded the footage. However, I really wanted to use this particular image for the background footage in this video because, as you've probably already noticed, I use reference very heavily in the process for this particular image, and I thought it was really important to include a good example at the beginning of this video before we started the discussion. That said, I will occasionally be interrupting the background footage with demonstrations and examples of the specific methods I'll be discussing in this video, so be sure and pay attention for that. Now, with all that business out of the way, let's really dig into the main topic of this video. As a starting point, I feel like it's really important that we talk about the context of the controversy that led me to make this video in the first place, and to a lesser extent, actually kind of even led me to make this YouTube channel. One important topic that frequently gets glossed over in discussions regarding modern art is just how young digital art as a format and the internet as a whole both are in the context of the larger history of art. Believe it or not, there was a time when you couldn't share or access artwork with a simple click of a button. The internet hasn't exactly existed forever. Well, unless you're one of my younger viewers, or mid-20-something viewers, or mid-30-something viewers. Sweet Mother Christmas, I'm old. Midlife crisis aside, with all that convenient, easy access to art, comes a tendency to abuse said convenience. You know, like an internet do. Couple that with a rampant lack of understanding of intellectual property laws, and all of a sudden in the early 2000s, you saw a major uptick in artists plagiarizing other artists, oftentimes not even realizing that they were doing anything wrong. After all, on the internet, your property is my property is their property. Obviously, it didn't take very long for artists to start fighting back to protect their own work, and for other artists to join in trying to spread the word that plagiarism is a bad thing. But, like all things on the internet, ideologies got twisted, things got blown out of proportion, and one problem led to another. Through a long series of twists and turns, what started out as a very reasonable plagiarism is bad eventually got twisted into using reference of any kind is cheating, which just frankly isn't true. Now, obviously, stealing somebody else's work is wrong. As an artist, you should never outright be copying somebody else's work, and certainly never go so far as doing something like tracing other artists' work, at least not in any professional capacity. There are a couple very specific situations where tracing is okay, and if you stick around to the end of the video, I'll talk to you about those. But suffice to say, you should never be tracing somebody else's work and claiming it as your own. That said, despite what Twitter might tell you, tracing and referencing are not the same. There are correct ways to reference and there are wrong ways to reference, and professional artists actually use reference in their work all the time. Quite the point, there are many instances in the professional art world where an employer would require an artist to use reference. Using reference helps to ensure accuracy and also greatly speeds up the art process, both of which are very important in the professional realm. Now, with all that context established, let's talk about some specific ways that you can correctly use reference in creating your artwork. There are essentially 3 types of images that you can use as reference for your artwork, each with their own pros and cons. Let's start by talking about using other people's artwork as a reference. And let me be clear, I'm not talking about tracing somebody else's artwork, I'm talking about using it as reference, and those are 2 very different things. When using somebody else's artwork as a starting point, you should generally avoid referencing it for things like anatomy or perspective. And the reason for this is pretty simple. If you can't do anatomy or perspective without reference, there's no guarantee that the artist that you're referencing could either, and you don't know whether or not they use reference. So in emulating anatomy and perspective from another artist, you run the danger of emulating their mistakes as well as their successes. Where referencing other artists' work does come in handy is in studying broader, more stylistic techniques. Things like line weight and approaches to shading, maybe how an artist draws a specific feature like a nose or eye shapes. But generally speaking, you're looking more at studies rather than directly emulating a piece. Using another artist's work as reference carries with it 2 major dangers. One of those, of course, being the aforementioned copying of their mistakes without realizing it, and by extension, learning bad habits that artist may have. The other risk that you run into in using another artist's piece of work as reference is that you might copy it a lot more closely than you intended to, which starts to lean into the area of plagiarism. Generally, as a rule of thumb, I would say that looking at other artists' work as reference for anything other than broad stylistic techniques is probably the least desirable approach. With that in mind, a better option than using somebody else's hand-drawn art is probably to use photography as reference, and there's a few ways that you can go about this with a few caveats that you have to be aware of. Using photo reference is probably one of the most common and longest standing approaches to using reference for artwork. It predates digital art and goes all the way back into the mid-1900s. When utilized correctly, it's a lot like having access to a live model in a live drawing class, just without the drawback of actually having to be in a classroom or actually have a live person in front of you. That said, just like hand-drawn illustration, photography in and of itself is a form of art and a form of intellectual property. So for that reason, just like with hand-drawn illustration, there are some correct ways to use it for reference and some wrong ways to use it for reference that we have to discuss. First of all, how you source your images is important. Some photographers are perfectly okay with their images being used for reference, some photographers are not okay with it, and some photographers even deliberately sell images with the specific intention of them being used as reference. What you really should try to avoid doing is just simply Googling images, downloading them, and using them as reference images, because you don't really have a way of knowing whether or not the photographer intended them for that purpose. When I use reference images, I actually have a specific photographer that I purchase my images from who sells them with that specific purpose. I'll actually be using one of their images for an example briefly a little bit later in this video, and I'll be sure to put a link in the description to their store so you can peruse their extensive catalog of reference images. Now, if all this talk about photo reference sounds just a little too good to be true, it's important to be aware that using photo reference doesn't come without certain disadvantages. First of all, when you're looking for photo reference, you might not always be able to find that perfect pose you're looking for or that exact scene that you want to use as a background, unless you know photography in addition to drawing and can shoot the photo yourself, which I admittedly sometimes do. When drawing characters specifically, the reference photo you have access to might not match the body type of your character and may need to be adjusted. Additionally, you might find that what looks perfectly natural in a photo looks stiff and awkward when referenced too closely in a drawing. Thankfully, all these problems are easy to resolve if you just follow some simple guidelines. In referencing a photo for drawing, if you choose to draw over top of the photo, which is a perfectly valid method of referencing a photo, you should try to avoid copying the photo exactly. You shouldn't be trying to draw every single detail of the photo. In the example currently playing on screen, you'll notice that I am drawing over top of the photo on a separate layer and only really drawing the broad general shapes of the photo to give myself a vague outline of what the image should look like. It allows me to see where the body part should be placed, how the limbs should overlap, and gives me a general guideline for placement of other features, but I'm not copying minute details. Because I've only blocked out the general shapes of the image, it's very easy for me to now resize things like the arm and the head to adjust the proportions to look a little bit more in line with what one expects from an art piece. Additionally, I can easily move parts of the image around to adjust the pose so it doesn't look quite as stiff. Then I can start building it out with my own style. If you want to add even more flexibility to this approach, putting each shape on a different layer gives you complete control over the size and angle of all the shapes in the image. That said, if you really want maximum flexibility in your reference images, that brings us to our third option, 3D models. Using 3D models for your reference images sidesteps most of the downsides of using photos, although with a couple new, albeit mild downsides of their own. With 3D models, you can create basically any pose that you want to create, and programs that allow you to do this easily are readily available and easily accessible. If you're one of the many digital artists already using Clip Studio Pro, that program has a 3D model library built into it and allows you to adjust the poses of the models very easily. If you don't have access to Clip Studio, there are more than a few other alternatives, but one that I highly recommend is a web-based program called Sketch.me. They also have a mobile app, and you should be seeing footage from that program on the screen presently. They aren't in any way, shape, or form sponsoring any of the content in this video. They're just a tool that I use routinely for my artwork and love to recommend them to fellow artists. There'll be a link down in the description if you want more information. Using a tool like Clip Studio Pro or Sketch.me, you can pose models in pretty much any pose that you need them to be in, and both programs also offer 3D models for various props that you might need reference images for as well. It is important to note that using 3D models does come with one very specific downside. Because 3D models are just collections of polygons and not soft and squishy like actual human beings are, sometimes you get a little bit of jank with the anatomy, especially at joints like the shoulders and hips and sometimes the ankles. For this reason, it's even more important to adhere to that method of just drawing out the shapes over top of the reference image rather than trying to copy the reference image exactly. Your mileage will vary, but as a general rule of thumb, I tend to alter the pose much more heavily when using 3D models than I do when using photo reference. Quite the point if you go back and look at the 3D model that I was using at the beginning of this video versus the final pose in the drawing, you'll notice that they're pretty significantly different. And it has a lot to do with the anatomy being a little bit janky on the 3D model and me wanting the pose to work a little bit more fluidly. With that in mind, while working from reference is excellent to assist you in dealing with anatomy that you find difficult to draw, it's also important not to let it become a crutch. You still need to work on learning basic anatomy. The bright side is, working from reference can also help you with that. I think you'll find that as you work more and more with reference, you'll find that you increasingly don't need it for various parts of the human anatomy. The same thing goes with perspective and geometry and all the other great various aspects of drawing complex scenes. So that covers all the basics regarding using reference in your drawings. But that said, before we go, I did kind of tease at the beginning that sometimes it's okay to trace in very, very specific situations. So now I think it's only fair, since you made it this far, that I elaborate on that. There are exactly two specific situations in which tracing is a-okay, but they both come with very, very heavy caveats, so pay very close attention. The first and most obvious situation is when you're learning how to draw. Believe it or not, tracing can actually be a great method for learning as long as it doesn't become a crutch, much like using reference. The caveat with tracing is that it's not something that you should be sharing online or putting in your portfolio, and it should certainly never be something that you're claiming as your own work. It's strictly for practice, it's strictly for your eyes only, it's a great learning tool, but that's all it should be. That said, there is one extremely specific scenario where tracing is okay in a professional capacity. American comics have a long-standing practice of allowing one artist to trace over another's work to make corrections to art in order to meet a tight deadline. Now, there's a whole sordid history there regarding how the American comic book industry handled artist rights in regard to their work. But in a modern context, just be aware that when something like that is done, it is done with both the permission of the original artist and the editor in charge of the publication. So everything is on the up and up, everyone's aware of what's going on, and it's used specifically to meet a deadline. So don't ever let anybody tell you that tracing is a completely useless skill. It does have a couple very specific applications, but they are very specific and very, very context sensitive. So that concludes our discussion on how to use reference when creating artwork. Did you find this video helpful? Do you have some hot takes of your own you'd like to share? Put them in the comments down below, but be sure to be respectful both to me and your fellow audience members. And you know what? If you liked what you saw here, it would be real spiffy if you'd click the subscribe and like buttons, and be sure to share with your friends. Every little bit helps, and your time is greatly appreciated. I'll be back next week with another informative and possibly controversial topic, but until then, thanks for watching.